going to go ahead and record lecture today. Today we're going to start chapter 21, which is on the lymphatic, which is otherwise known as the lymphoid system. Okay. The lymphatic system traditionally included all of the lymph vessels, which helped return fluid that leaked out of the smaller vessels of the circulatory system and return the blood to the venous system of the cardiovascular system, as well as certain lymph organs. The term lymphoid refers to specific cells and tissues that are part of the lymphatic system. It's recognized more and more that there are clusters of lymphatic cells located in the walls of some of the hollow organs, like some of the parts of the digestive system. And those clusters of lymphatic cells, since they're not surrounded by an outer covering of connective tissue, they're not considered to be a true organ. They're really more of just a part of the organ that they're located in, like part of the digestive system, like the ileum of the large intestine, or excuse me, ileum of the small intestine. So lymphoid refers to some of these other cells and tissues that are part of this organ system. The function of those individual cells and tissues is to monitor the bacteria that are found in our digestive tract, and to ensure that the bacteria that are there are ones that provide benefits and not bacteria that are harmful. So if they do detect bacteria that are harmful, they can then immobilize an immune response. Okay, before we get going though, I'd like you to answer a review question. This is actually concerned with chapter 20 on blood vessels and blood pressure. So the pulse pressure, you need to know the pulse pressure in order to calculate the mean arterial pressure from the systolic pressure to the diastolic pressure. So the pulse pressure, it says, is the difference between the systolic pressure and which other pressure? Last call for answers? Okay, there we go. Okay, most of you said diastolic pressure, that's correct. Okay. And the reason that you might want to calculate the pulse pressure is because you can estimate the mean arterial pressure by starting with the diastolic pressure and then adding 1/3 of the pulse pressure. And there was a question about that on this last exam, and I don't remember. I think the systolic pressure, if I remember right, was 110, and the diastolic pressure was what was it? It was 50. Yeah, diastolic pressure was 50. So the pulse pressure then would be 60. So to calculate the mean arterial pressure, you have to take 1/3 of 60, which is 20, and then add that to the diastolic pressure, which was 50. So 20 and 50 is 70. So the correct answer for that question was 70. All right. So lymphatic system or lymphoid system is a network of organs and vein-like vessels that recovers tissue fluid or lymph, as well as lymphoid tissues that are found in the walls of some of the digestive organs. They're actually part of the digestive system, as well as lymphatic organs themselves. Lymphatic organs include things like the lymph nodes, the spleen, and also the thymus. Okay. Now, the main function of the lymphatic system or lymphoid system is to inspect for disease agents and activate immune responses in addition to the recovery of fluid. And a third major function of the lymphatic system is actually found in the digestive system. There are tiny lymph capillaries in the walls of the digestive tract that are involved in the absorption of lipids, and those tiny lymph vessels are called lacteals. So in this chapter, we're going to list the functions of the lymphatic system, explains how lymph forms and how it is returned back to the bloodstream through the lymph vessels. We're going to look at the names of some of the major cells of the lymphatic system that play a role in the immune response. We're going to name and describe the types of lymphatic tissue, and then finally describe the structure and function of some of the major lymphatic organs, such as red bone marrow, the thymus, lymph nodes, tonsils, and the spleen. All right, so one of the main functions, as I said, is fluid recovery. Fluid continually filters from the blood capillaries into the tissue spaces because the capillaries have such thin walls. And actually the capillaries reabsorb the majority of that fluid that leaks out. The capillaries reabsorb about 85% of the fluid that leaks out of the capillary beds. But that leaves 15% of the blood of the fluid that leaks out of the blood in the interstitial spaces, which is the fluid-filled space between cells, and that includes about half of the plasma proteins that escape from the capillaries, and then the lymphatic system returns that fluid back to the closed circulatory system. A second function of the lymphatic or lymphoid system is immunity, provides immunity to infection. When fluid escapes from the blood vessels, it'll sometimes pick up foreign cells like bacteria and viruses and chemicals from the tissues. And as that fluid returns back towards the right and left subclavian veins, which is where they re-enter the closed circulation, they carry some of those foreign bodies with them. And along the routes that fluid takes to the lymphatic system, there are structures called lymph nodes. The lymph nodes are filled full of lymphocytes, which are cells of our immune system. And those lymphocytes can phagocytize those foreign particles and also mobilize a larger immune response that results in the production of specialized cells called T cells and also cells that can produce proteins called antibodies. Antibodies are able to bind to foreign particles and basically mark them for destruction. Makes it easier for phagocytic cells to phagocytize those foreign bodies. And so in doing so, that activates a protective immune response. Now, another very important function of the lymphatic system that I think tends to be overlooked by students quite a bit is lipid absorption. Lipids are absorbed in the digestive system a lot differently than most nutrients. Most nutrients like glucose and amino acids are absorbed directly into capillaries that are in the walls of the digestive tract. From those capillaries, those nutrients then flow into microscopic vessels called vanules, which eventually combine to form the hepatic portal vein, which carries those nutrients into the liver, where some of them are processed. Now, lipids, however, are absorbed by a very, very different route. Lipids are absorbed by small lymph vessels that look sort of like lymph capillaries. In fact, they're almost identical to lymph capillaries. And these vessels are called lacteals. And so lacteals absorb lipids. The lipids then have to pass through the whole lymphatic system until that fluid, that nutrient-rich fluid, is emptied into either the right or left subclavian vein. So that's the first time it actually enters the circulatory system, is after it goes through all the lymph vessels and is filtered by the lymph nodes. And so the blood then carries those lipids. First, the blood returns to the right atrium of the heart, and then it circulates through the heart, goes through the pulmonary circulation, and it's pumped out through the systemic circulation. And eventually, it makes its way to the liver, and it's distributed to all the tissues of the body, which can use lipids as an energy source. So lipids take a very circuitous route through the body before they're made available to cells as a source of nutrition. It's a much longer route than the route that simple sugars like glucose and amino acids take. So remember that term, lacteal. That's just a lymph capillary that's found in the walls of mostly the small intestines. That's where most of the nutrients are absorbed. All right, so the main components of the lymphatic system include the lymph, which is the fluid that leaks out of the blood vessels. Lymph is a clear, colorless fluid, similar in concentration or similar in composition to plasma, but there's less protein because proteins are large enough that they can't escape through the walls of the capillaries. But some smaller proteins and medium-sized proteins can leak out of the capillaries. Second component are the lymphatic vessels. These are what absorb the lymph and then transport the lymph back towards eventually the lymph vessels empty into either the right or left subclavian veins. That's where the lymph is delivered into the circulatory system. So lymphatic vessels transport the lymph. Then there's lymphatic tissues. Lymphatic tissues are aggregations of lymphocytes that are in the walls of some of the hollow organs, like the walls of the digestive tract. Those lymphocytes monitor the bacteria that's in our digestive tract and make sure that the ones that are there are ones that are either harmless or beneficial. But if they detect that there's harmful bacteria, they can mobilize an immune response. And then finally, there's the lymphatic organs. Lymphatic organs are surrounded by a thin covering of connective tissue. And so they are their own distinct organs. And lymphatic organs, most of them are involved in producing or supporting cells that are part of our immune system. For example, the thymus. Thymus is an example of one of the lymphatic organs. The thymus sits usually just anterior to the pulmonary trunk, and right in that mediastinum, that area between our two lungs. And the thymus is where T cells go to mature. And there's also a process that occurs in the thymus called clonal selection, where T cells that have the potential for mobilizing the immune response against our own cells, those potentially harmful T cells are eliminated from the body in the thymus. So that helps to prevent autoimmune disorders from occurring. Okay, so that's just one example of a lymphatic organ. And so they're usually separated from other organs by a very distinct layer of connective tissue. All right, so the sequence of the lymphatic vessels, which are just one of the components of the lymphatic system, start with the lymph capillaries. Lymph capillaries is where the lymph is absorbed by the lymphatic system. Lymph capillaries, we'll take a close look at their structure. They're very similar to capillaries in that they have very thin walls, but the squamous cells that make up the walls of the lymph capillaries don't generally have tight organs, or tight junctions. Instead, the squamous cells that make up the walls of the lymph capillaries are overlapping. They overlap. And so there's actually a little space where they overlap where fluid can be absorbed through. So that's where lymph is absorbed. Then the lymph passes into larger lymphatic vessels called collecting vessels. From the collecting vessels, it then passes through even larger lymphatic vessels called lymphatic trunks, of which there are 6 of them. And then these 6 lymphatic trunks eventually flow into 2 different collecting ducts. And one of them is called the thoracic duct, and the other one is called the right lymphatic duct. Those 2 collecting ducts then empty into the left and right subclavian veins, which is where the lymph ends up. So it enters the venous circulation, is the first point when it goes back into the cardiovascular system. All right, so this is a diagram showing a typical lymph capillary. And like I said, one difference between the lymph capillaries and regular capillaries are that the squamous cells of the lymph capillaries overlap, and the cells are not held together by tight junctions. So there's a little bit of a gap here where those squamous cells overlap, that lymph can enter the lymph capillary. Another difference between a lymphatic capillary and a regular capillary in the circulatory system is that lymph capillaries have a blind end. They're closed at one end, all right? Whereas capillaries are open at both ends because the capillaries are continuous with the other blood vessels. But so lymph can go in, and since one end is blind, there's only one direction for the lymph to flow, and that's towards the collecting ducts, the collecting vessels, larger lymphatic vessels. So when we move around, these tissues that surround these lymph capillaries get squeezed. When that tissue gets squeezed, the fluid is pushed under pressure into these lymph capillaries, and then from there they flow into larger and larger lymphatic vessels. So this is an example of one of those collecting vessels. This is a larger one. Collecting vessels are similar in one way to veins. And there was a question on this last test also on veins that always surprised at how many students miss it. Question was, what blood vessels contain internal valves? And the answer is veins. The veins have valves that ensure that the blood flows back towards the heart, and it can't go the wrong direction. Okay, so these larger lymph vessels also have valves, just like veins. So they're kind of similar in structure to the veins. In fact, some of them probably fairly closely resemble veins. They're not really green like this one is shown here. I think the artist just took liberty when he did it green. They're not green. They're usually clear when you see them in a cadaver. Okay. So these are scattered kind of throughout the body. Then eventually, the lymph flows into one of two lymphatic ducts. Okay, the largest one is called the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct receives lymph from all of the left side of the body and the lower right side of the body. So the lower part of the right trunk and your legs, as well as all the lymph from the left side of the body, eventually flows into the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct, which is real short, it's just right here, it then enters the left subclavian vein. So lymph from all the parts of the body except for the upper right quadrant of the body flow through the thoracic duct and enter the left subclavian vein. The lymph from the upper right-hand quadrant of the body, so that would include the right side of the head and neck and the right arm, that flows into the right lymphatic duct. And the right lymphatic duct then carries the lymph into the right subclavian vein. So ultimately, all the lymph goes into either the left subclavian vein or the right subclavian vein. Okay. Easy way to remember it is lymph from the upper right-hand portion of the body goes through the right lymphatic duct in the right subclavian vein. Lymph from all the other parts of the body go into the thoracic duct, which enters the left subclavian vein. All right, now, in addition to the lymph capillaries and the lymph vessels, or lymphatic vessels, there's also lymphatic cells, most of which play a role in the immune response. One type of lymphatic cells that are responsible for immune surveillance are called natural killer cells, or NK cells for short. These are very large lymphocytes that can attack and destroy bacteria. Also transplanted tissue, if the transplanted tissue is not a match. Host cells infected with viruses, or even cancer cells. Natural killer cells can attack and destroy cells that have become cancerous in the body. So they're responsible for at least part of the immune surveillance of the immune system. And so these natural killer cells, they're actually capable of destroying a fairly wide range of cell types, of foreign cells. So natural killer cells are considered to be one of what's called our non-specific defenses, because they can attack and destroy a wide range of different types of cells. T cells are another type of cell. T cells, on the other hand, are much more specific. They're part of what's called our specific defense mechanisms. The specific defenses target a specific disease-causing agent. And these T lymphocytes can stimulate a B cell, which in turn turns into another cell type called a plasma cell, which can then begin secreting antibodies. Antibodies are proteins that can bind to foreign agents. And T cells, like I said earlier, mature in the thymus. They might, so newly produced T cells migrate to the thymus where they mature, and the thymus also destroys T cells that have the potential of mobilizing an autoimmune response. In other words, ones that have a potential of attacking our own cells. Okay, which kind of explains why, if a person has their thymus removed for some reason, very rarely the thymus become cancerous, but it does happen. It's very rare, but every once in a while a person will get a tumor in the thymus that requires that the thymus be removed. And in those patients where they've had their thymus removed, it's not uncommon for them to get a disorder called myasthenia gravis. And in myasthenia gravis, since they don't have the thymus to remove those potentially harmful T cells, their body is not able to get rid of them, and so they can actually, some of the T cells can actually activate B cells that can produce antibodies against some of our own cells. And so one of the results of myasthenia gravis is that it can result in autoimmune disorders, where antibodies start attacking things like some of the nerve fibers. They're part of our nervous system. And so it can cause a person to start getting weak and actually getting paralyzed, because the antibodies cause the destruction of some of their nerves. Another cell type are B cells. B cells are another one of the two kinds of lymphocytes. When B cells are activated by a helper T cell, the B cells multiply to produce more B cells, some of which can become memory B cells, which can produce a longer lasting immunity to infection. And other B cells go on to mature into plasma cells, which start producing antibodies. Now, the antibodies that are produced by the B cells in response to stimulation by the T cells are actually very, very specific. They're specific for a single antigen or a single pathogen. And so this is part of what's called our specific defenses. They're specific for just a single antigen. So it's very specific, but the response is fairly strong, and so it's a stronger response to infection than the non-specific defenses. All right, then another one of the cells of our immune system are macrophages. Macrophages are sometimes called antigen-presenting cells because they're phagocytic cells that can phagocytize foreign particles. And the reason they're called antigen-presenting cells is that when they phagocytize a foreign particle like a bacterial cell, the macrophages don't completely digest the antigens that are on the surface of foreign cells like bacteria. Instead, they actually will display those antigens on their surface, kind of like a trophy. Hey, look at what I killed, just like a hunter. And when they display those antigens on their surface, along with self markers, that attracts and activates a T cell, which can stimulate B cells to start multiplying in order to produce antigen-producing plasma cells. So macrophages are called antigen-presenting cells because they present antigens on their surface, which can initiate a whole series of events that can result in antibody production. So macrophages are actually they're sort of the first step in stimulating antibody production. And that whole series of events usually, not always, but usually involves a macrophage, a T cell that's stimulated by the macrophage, and then a B cell that's stimulated by a T cell. All right, then there are some other phagocytic cells that are found in specific places in the body called dendritic cells. They very similar to the macrophages. They just have different shapes. They usually are their cytoplasm is very branched. They have lots of cytoplasmic extensions. They also can alert the immune system to pathogens that breach the surface of the body. There's a lot of dendritic cells located in the epidermis, which is right at the surface of our body. Then there's reticular cells. Reticular cells are stationary cells that are branched that contribute to the tissue of a lymphatic organ. So reticular cells act as antigen-presenting cells in the thymus. All right, then another major type of, or major component of the lymphatic system are lymphatic tissues. Lymphatic tissues are also known as lymphoid tissues. They're basically just clusters or aggregations of lymphocytes in the connective tissue of mucous membranes and the walls of hollow organs like the digestive system. There's two different types of lymphatic tissues. The first is called diffuse lymphatic tissue. This occurs in the walls of some organs where the lymphocytes are scattered rather than being densely clustered. They're prevalent in body passages open to the exterior, like in the respiratory system, the digestive system, the urinary and reproductive tracts. And diffuse lymphatic tissue is also known as mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT for short. Then there's also lymphatic nodules or follicles. These are different than lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are actually lymph organs. They're true lymph organs. Lymphatic nodules are denser concentrations of lymphocytes that are in the walls of other organs. And these are a constant feature within lymph nodes, which actually make up an entire lymph organ. They're found in tonsils and also the appendix. In the walls of the last part of the small intestine, which is called the ileum, there are dense clusters of lymphocytes that are called Payer patches or mesenteric patches. And those are another type of lymphatic nodules or lymph follicles. So lymph nodule is just a denser concentration of lymphocytes, whereas diffuse lymphatic tissue is just more diffuse. There's just not as concentrated of a cluster of lymphocytes. And then finally, there are the lymphatic organs. Lymphatic organs are actually a whole organ unto themselves that are separated from other organs by a thin layer of connective tissue. And there are two types of lymphatic organs. There are primary lymphatic organs. The primary lymphatic organs are involved in the production of new cells of the lymphatic system and blood cells. as well as the thymus, because the thymus is involved in maturation of T cells and the clonal selection of T cells. And then the other ones are all called secondary lymphatic organs. Secondary lymphatic organs are involved in immune surveillance. They keep an eye out for harmful pathogens. Secondary lymphatic organs include lymph nodes, tonsils, and the spleen. And this is where lymphocytes are located that can phagocytize and mobilize an immune response. So primary lymphatic organs are where these lymphatic cells are produced. Secondary lymphatic organs are where the mature cells of the immune system live. Okay, that's where they live and monitor our body for foreign pathogens. Okay, so the very first of the primary lymphatic organs is red bone marrow. Now, you wouldn't think that red bone marrow would constitute an organ, but it actually does. Red bone marrow is involved in hemopoiesis, which is blood cell formation, and also immunity, because it produces the cells of the immune system. So red bone marrow is a soft, very loosely organized, highly vascular tissue. It's separated from the osseous tissue by the endosteum of bone. Okay, the endosteum is a thin layer of connective tissue that covers the inside of a bone. So as blood cells mature, they then push their way through the reticular and endothelial cells to enter a sinus, and they flow away into the bloodstream. So this is a photomicrograph up here on the screen. There's some reticular tissue here. It's a type of connective tissue. And then in between here you have stem cells and developing blood cells. So this is an artist's conception of red bone marrow. There are sinusoids that newly produced blood cells and immune cells can squeeze their way into, and then from the sinusoids it flows into blood vessels, which then can exit the bone. There's tiny holes. If you actually look on the surface of a bone, there's tiny holes that are called nutrient foramina. And those holes actually allow for the passage of small blood vessels into and out of the bone. So this is a sinusoid here, there's another one here, and then all these other cells in here are stem cells and also newly produced blood cells. Notice right here along the wall of the sinusoids, notice you can see a cell squeezing into the lumen of that sinusoid. That's a newly produced blood cell, which could be either an erythrocyte, a red blood cell, or it could be a cell of the immune system. So the red bone marrow actually constitutes an organ unto itself. Next lymphatic organ is the thymus. I already talked about the thymus quite a bit. The thymus actually sits just anterior to the pulmonary trunk. It's actually embedded in the pericardial sac, and it's much larger in children than it is in adults. And in adults, it usually kind of shrinks down and gets a lot smaller, becomes filled with a lot more connective tissue, but it's larger in children, and T cells migrate to the thymus where they mature, and the thymus also, as I said, it gets rid of those T cells that have the potential of triggering an autoimmune response. So this like I said, it's very rare for people to get cancer of the thymus, but there are always a few cases every year in the United States. My father actually got a it's called a carcinomic thymoma. The doctor told him you're only one of maybe 3 people that get this every year. It's a very rare form of cancer. And they did a biopsy on his thymus, and the biopsy came back as it was benign. It was a benign tumor, which was good news. But the surgeon said we still have to remove it because it is growing and taking up space. So they scheduled him for surgery, and when it came time for him to have surgery, the surgeon got the flu, got influenza. So they had to cancel the surgery. And my dad lived in Oregon, and hospitals there are a lot busier. So it took a couple months for them to reschedule the surgery. By the time they did the surgery, the tumor had already grown around one of his phrenic nerves, which supplies your diaphragm, causes your diaphragm to contract. It's one of the main respiratory muscles. And it also grew into one lung. And so they had to remove part of a lung. They had to cut one of his phrenic nerves, so his diaphragm only worked on one half. And it really messed him up. And sure enough, after they removed his thymus, and then after they did the surgery, they had the tumor tested again to make sure it wasn't malignant, and come to find out it actually was. And I don't know if it had become malignant from the time they did the biopsy until they did the surgery, or if the biopsy just missed that part of it, so it was malignant. But it turned out it was cancerous, and after they removed his thymus, then he started having autoimmune problems, because without a thymus, there's no way for your body to weed out those T cells that could potentially produce an immune response. So there is no cure for that myasthenia gravis. There's a treatment for it, and the treatment is kind of interesting. The way they treat it is they give you infusions of antibodies. They collect blood from other people, and then they concentrate the antibodies from the blood, and then they give that to people that have myasthenia gravis as a treatment. And I asked the doctor, I said, well, how does that work? Because when you have myasthenia gravis, the problem is that your body is producing antibodies that are attacking your own body. So how would giving a person even more antibodies solve the problem? And he said, we don't know how it works, it just does. Sometimes it helps. It doesn't always help, sometimes it helps. So anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. So apparently when they give you more antibodies, your body somehow senses that and it decreases its own antibody production. And I don't think anybody knows how that works exactly, how your body senses that, but it does help in some cases. So. All right, so this is a diagram. This just shows, this is the sternum here, obviously, the manubrium, the body, xiphoid process. So this is red bone marrow. You also have red bone marrow inside your sternum. It produces lymphocytes like B cells and T cells. The B cells just go into your bloodstream and also into your lymph nodes. The T cells, some of them migrate from the bone marrow into the thymus, where they mature. Some of them are eliminated by the thymus that might be harmful. And then eventually those T cells leave the thymus and go into lymph nodes, and they circulate in the blood, where they undergo surveillance for foreign particles and mobilize immune response if necessary. Okay. Now we have at least one more lymph organ that we don't have time to talk about today, so we'll have to finish this up on Friday. Another one is the spleen. The spleen, one of its main functions is to break down either worn out, red blood cells that either worn out or are damaged. Those are filtered out and destroyed by the spleen. So it's kind of where red blood cells go to die. All right, so we're out of time, so we'll stop here. We'll quickly finish this up on Friday. We might have a short class.